heavy chrome doors of the 14th floor elevator slid open with a hiss, and Christina A. Chapman stepped out like she was the only person in Seoul who knew the sun was still free. She wasn't just wearing clothes. She was wearing a statement of war. Her emerald green satin cowl-neck dress caught the harsh overhead lights, shimmering like liquid neon against her skin, while her cherry-red tailored blazer sat draped over her shoulders, broad and unapologetic. Her boots, oxblood leather with a sharp, square toe, didn't just walk on the marble. They claimed it, making a rhythmic, hollow thud that cut through the hushed murmurs of the waiting room. She carried a crescent-shaped hobo bag in deep cognac, slung over her arm with the casual ease of someone who had nothing to prove and even less to hide. Her jewelry was a single, matte gold sculptural choker, thick and unyielding, looking more like a piece of modern armor than an ornament. But the clothing was just the frame. What stopped the breath of every woman in that room, what made the photographers pause mid-adjustment, was the hair. Christina A. Chapman possessed a ginger afro so vast and vibrant it felt like a cosmic event. It grew thick and proud, a halo of coils shifting from deep burnt umber at the roots to a brilliant, defiant copper gold at the tips. It was a texture and a color the city wasn't prepared for. In a room full of sleek, black-clad shadows, she wasn't just a woman. She was a fire that had just walked into a paper house. The 14th floor of the Shinwa building didn't feel like a high-fashion studio. It felt like a meat locker. The air was pressurized, scrubbed clean of scent, and kept at a temperature that made the porcelain doll models in the waiting room huddle into their thin, black designer cardigans. There were 42 of them, a monochrome sea of obsidian fabric and sleek, pin-straight hair, all waiting to be projected upon by the scouts of Sun Noir. Then the chrome elevator hissed open, and Christina A. Chapman stepped out like a fire alarm ringing in a library. The visual disruption was violent. Her emerald green satin cowl-neck dress shimmered with a liquid neon intensity that seemed to suck the color out of the white walls. Draped over her shoulders was a cherry-red tailored blazer, broad-shouldered and defiant. But it was her hair that truly paralyzed the room, a massive, textured ginger afro, a crown of coils that shifted from burnt umber to a brilliant, sun-kissed copper at the tips. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the polite cruelty began. The woman 2 seats down, cheekbones like glass shards and a severe bun, leaned toward her friend. "Did she lose her way to the Itaewon Street Festival?" she whispered in sharp, rapid-fire Korean. Her friend giggled, a dry, papery sound. "Maybe she thinks this is a circus audition. Look at that hair. It looks like a sunset exploded on a bush." Christina didn't flinch. She settled into a minimalist white chair, crossed her long legs, and pulled a small bag from her cognac hobo bag. With slow, deliberate grace, she popped a salted plantain chip into her mouth. The crunch echoed in the sterile room like a gunshot. She looked directly at the woman with the bun, her amber eyes unblinking and predatory. She understood every venomous syllable. She let the salt linger on her tongue, a private grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. They thought she was a clueless foreigner. They had no idea the fire had already arrived, and the building was about to burn. Behind the frosted glass of the observation suite, Billy Langner sat in a chair that cost more than most people's annual rent, nursing a glass of mineral water that was exactly 4 degrees Celsius. He kept the room at a bracing chill. It kept his mind sharp and his subordinates shivering. For 40 minutes, he had watched a parade of identical porcelain perfections through the high-definition monitors. They were beautiful, certainly, but they were static, blank canvases waiting for a soul they didn't possess. "Next group," his assistant, Hyen Woo, murmured, checking a tablet. Billy didn't look up until the monitors flared with a sudden, violent saturation of color. It was like a thermal bloom on a radar screen. He leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. In a room of grayscale shadows, a woman had just arrived who looked like she'd been forged in a furnace. The emerald green satin of her dress vibrated against the screen, but it was the ginger afro, a defiant, multitonal crown of copper and mahogany that rearranged the visual geometry of the entire studio. "Who is she?" Billy's voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "Christina A. Chapman, independent, from New York via St. Lucia," Hyen Woo replied, flipping through digital files. "The scouts think she's too loud for the brand's minimalist aesthetic." Billy watched her on the screen. She wasn't fidgeting like the others. She wasn't touching her face or smoothing her hair to fit the porcelain mold. She was sitting there, eating what looked like dried fruit, her St. Lucian steel gaze fixed directly on the women whispering behind her. She didn't look like a diversity hire or a grateful outsider. She looked like a predator who had found a particularly dull pack of sheep. He didn't want a model who would disappear into his clothes. He wanted that energy, that absolute refusal to be small. "Cancel the rest of the afternoon," Billy said, setting his glass down with a sharp clack. "I'm going down there." Behind the frosted glass of the observation suite, Billy Langner sat in a chair that cost more than most people's annual rent, nursing a glass of mineral water that was exactly 4 degrees Celsius. He kept the room at a bracing chill. It kept his mind sharp and his subordinates shivering. For 40 minutes, he had watched a parade of identical porcelain perfections through the high-definition monitors. They were beautiful, certainly, but they were static, blank canvases waiting for a soul they didn't possess. "Next group," his assistant, Hyen Woo, murmured, checking a tablet. Billy didn't look up until the monitors flared with a sudden, violent saturation of color. It was like a thermal bloom on a radar screen. He leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. In a room of grayscale shadows, a woman had just arrived who looked like she'd been forged in a furnace. The emerald green satin of her dress vibrated against the screen, but it was the ginger afro, a defiant, multitonal crown of copper and mahogany that rearranged the visual geometry of the entire studio. "Who is she?" Billy's voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "Christina A. Chapman, independent, from New York via St. Lucia," Hyen Woo replied, flipping through digital files. "The scouts think she's too loud for the brand's minimalist aesthetic." Billy watched her on the screen. She wasn't fidgeting like the others. She wasn't touching her face or smoothing her hair to fit the porcelain mold. She was sitting there, eating what looked like dried fruit, her St. Lucian steel gaze fixed directly on the women whispering behind her. She didn't look like a diversity hire or a grateful outsider. She looked like a predator who had found a particularly dull pack of sheep. He didn't want a model who would disappear into his clothes. He wanted that energy, that absolute refusal to be small. "Cancel the rest of the afternoon," Billy said, setting his glass down with a sharp clack. "I'm going down there." The smell of mapogu was different from the salt-heavy air of St. Lucia or the exhaust-thick heat of Brooklyn. But inside her tiny apartment, Christina had forced the worlds to collide. The small kitchen was clouded with the steam of stewed chicken, the Scotch bonnet peppers she'd sourced from a specialty market, providing a slow, creeping burn that felt like home. She stood at the counter in an oversized vintage carnival tee, her ginger afro wrapped loosely in a silk scarf. After the sterile, high-tension vacuum of Shinwa building, the bubbling pot was the only thing keeping her grounded. She had moved to Seoul 2 years ago on a dare to herself, to see if a girl from the islands could conquer a city built on porcelain and silence. Today, the silence had been broken by a man with hands like granite. Her phone buzzed against the formica. It was a FaceTime from Solange. "Girl, I heard," Solange's voice crackled from Atlanta, her face squeezed with worry. "Priya called me. She said the ghost of Seoul handpicked you. Christina, listen to me. Billy Langner isn't just some fashion mogul. He's the shadow behind the logistics. People who cross him don't just lose their jobs, they evaporate." "He didn't seem like a ghost," Christina murmured, tasting the gravy. "He felt solid, too solid." "That's the problem. He's a monolith, Tina. Be careful. You're playing with a man who owns the docks and the dark." As the call ended, a notification lit up the screen from an unsaved number. The text was short, written in formal Korean that felt like a command. "Shin Noir callback. Saturday 0900, floor 22. Dress code, yourself." Christina stared at the words. Dress code. Yourself. In an industry that spent every waking hour trying to shave her down, thin her hair, and mute her colors, the instruction was the most dangerous thing she had ever read. She took a bite of the chicken, the heat blooming in her chest. Billy Langner wanted her fire. She'd give him the whole volcano. The elevator to the 22nd floor didn't play music. It hummed with the low-frequency vibration of heavy machinery. When the doors opened, the fashion world Christina knew vanished. There was no white marble here. The walls were raw, shuttered concrete, and the floor was polished black steel that reflected her image like a dark mirror. Christina stepped out, her wide-legged chocolate trousers catching the air as she moved. She wore a cream-ribbed turtleneck that hugged her curves, topped with her signature gold sculptural choker. Her ginger afro was out in its full, rounded glory, a defiant crown in a room designed to make people feel small. Billy Langner didn't have a desk. He had a monolithic slab of basalt positioned in front of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gray sprawl of Seoul. There were no Vogue magazines on his table, only digital logistics maps, blueprints of shipping docks, and a wall of silent surveillance monitors flickering with grainy footage of warehouses. "You're late," Billy rasped without turning. The room was so cold Christina could see her own breath. "Exactly on time," she replied, her Korean crisp and fearless. "A monolith, like you should appreciate punctuality." Billy turned. His eyes traveled from her boots to the gold at her throat, finally resting on her face. He slid a thick black card across the basalt. An unlimited line, a housing contract for a penthouse in Hanamdong, a security detail, all yours the moment you sign the exclusivity clause for Sun Noir. Christina didn't touch the card. She leaned against the cold basalt, her amber eyes mocking his. "You're trying to buy a pet, Mr. Langner. I'm a partner. I don't want your unlimited line. I want a seat at the creative table and the right to walk out if you ever try to dim my light." Tension in the air snapped like a live wire. Billy stepped into her space, his scent cedarwood and cold iron overwhelming her. He was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his chest, a stark contrast to the freezing room. "A dangerous woman, Christina Chapman," he whispered, his hand hovering near her gold choker. "And you're a man used to owning shadows," she countered, not backing down an inch. "I'm the sun. You don't own the sun, you just hope it doesn't burn you." The industrial loft in Seongsudong was a hive of frantic activity, but the atmosphere was toxic. Christina sat in the makeup chair, her emerald green satin dress hanging on a rack nearby like a captured flag. In the corner, a group of the rejected models from the audition, led by the woman with the glass-shard cheekbones, watched with predatory smirks. They had whispered to a lead stylist, a man whose hands shook as he approached Christina's wardrobe with a concealed pair of shears. "Wait," Christina said, her voice cutting through the hum of the steamer. She had noticed the frayed seam on the red blazer, a deliberate, jagged tear that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Before she could stand, the heavy steel doors of the loft slammed open. Billy Langner didn't enter alone. 4 men in charcoal suits, the logistics team moved with military precision, flanking the panicked stylist. Billy walked toward the wardrobe rack, his face a mask of cold, architectural fury. He picked up the ruined blazer, feeling the torn fabric between his fingers. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. The silence he brought into the room was heavier than a scream. "Who paid you?" Billy's voice was a low, guttural vibration. The stylist crumbled, pointing a shaking finger toward the cluster of models in the corner. Billy didn't look at them. He made a slight, sharp gesture with his chin. 2 of his men stepped toward the women, their shadows swallowing the rivals' expensive black dresses. "Mr. Langner, it was just a joke," the lead rival began, her voice trembling. "My brand is not a joke," Billy whispered, leaning into her space. "And she is not someone you touch." He turned to his lead security head. "Ensure they never work in this hemisphere again. And the stylist, take him to the warehouse. We need to discuss the cost of damaged goods." Christina watched, a chill creeping up her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She saw the raw, unchecked power in Billy's eyes, the Mafia reality behind the silk suits. He wasn't just protecting her career, he was marking his territory with blood and fear. "Billy, stop," she said, her voice firm despite the racing of her heart. He turned to her, the darkness in his gaze flickering for a split second. "I told you, Christina, I don't let anyone dim your light." The penthouse office was silent, save for the low hum of the server banks and the distant, muffled roar of Seoul's Saturday traffic. Christina stood in the center of the room, her emerald green dress a vibrant slash of color against the cold, gray concrete. She didn't look at the city view. She looked at Billy, who was calmly pouring a drink, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. "Warehouse." Christina's voice wasn't shaking, but it was sharp. "Is that where you send people who don't fit your aesthetic, Billy? Or just anyone who gets in your way?" Billy didn't turn. "I protect my investments, Christina. The world I inhabit doesn't respond to polite requests. It responds to weight." "I am not an investment," she countered, stepping into his personal space until she could smell the iron and cedarwood again. "And I am not your protected pet. If I am the face of Sun Noir, then I lead the room. I don't need you to clear it for me with threats and security details. When you do that, You make me look like a fragile porcelain doll. And you've seen my hair, Billy. Do I look fragile to you? She tilted her head, her ginger afro catching the dim light, the copper tips glowing like dying embers. Billy finally turned, his dark eyes searching hers. For the first time, the predatory mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine fascination. No one in Seoul, not his board members, not his rivals, not even the men who worked the docks, had ever set a boundary with him. They all wanted his shadow to cover them. She wanted to stand in the sun alone. "My logistics empire," he began, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He walked to the surveillance wall, turning off the grainy warehouse feeds. "It isn't just about moving silk and watches. It's about the flow of everything this city needs but doesn't want to see. Power isn't just owning the building, Christina. It's owning the silence between the bricks." He looked back at her, a dark, dangerous invitation in his gaze. "You want to lead the room? Fine, but you need to understand what's actually in the room with us." Neon pulse of Hongdae was a frantic blur outside, but inside the vault, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and unspoken threats. This wasn't a K-pop club. It was a subterranean cathedral of dark wood and brushed steel. Billy didn't take her to a VIP booth. He led her to the center of the floor, then simply stepped back into the shadows, his arms crossed over his charcoal suit. "Room is yours, Christina," he murmured, his dark eyes challenging her. "Show me how you lead it." A circle of men, the true architects of Seoul's logistics, tightened around her. They were heavy-set, scarred, and dressed in silks that couldn't hide the holsters beneath. One man, a local lieutenant with a jagged tattoo snaking up his neck, looked at Christina's vibrant ginger afro and laughed. "Mr. Langner has a colorful new pet," he sneered in Korean, his voice dripping with condescension. "Does it speak, or just stand there looking like a tropical bird?" Christina didn't look at Billy. She didn't have to. She stepped toward the lieutenant, her emerald green dress catching the crimson light of the club. She tilted her head, her amber eyes mocking. "I speak enough to know your accent is from a gutter in Busan," she replied in flawless, razor-sharp Korean, her Seoul-accented slang hitting him like a physical blow. "And I stand here because I'm the only thing in this room you can't afford. If you want to talk about pets, let's discuss the way you wag your tail every time Billy looks your way." Room went deathly silent. Then a slow, deep chuckle broke the tension from the lieutenant himself. He bowed, genuinely impressed by the St. Lucian steel in her voice. By the time they reached the bar, Christina had the room in the palm of her hand, navigating the dangerous politics of the underworld with the same grace she used on the runway. Billy watched her from the shadows, his heart doing something it hadn't done in a decade. He hadn't acquired a model. He had met his match. He stepped close, his hand resting not on her waist, but on the small of her back, a gesture of equals. "You didn't just lead the room," he whispered. "You owned it." "I told you, Billy," she said, leaning into his heat. "I don't need a cage, I just need a stage." The night air in Gangnam was electric, humming with the sound of thousands of onlookers and the frantic strobe of 100 paparazzi cameras. At precisely 9:00 p.m., the digital monoliths of the COEX intersection went dark. Then, with a synchronized hum that felt like a heartbeat, the largest 3D billboard in Seoul ignited. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. There she was, Christina A. Chapman, towering 50 feet high over the city. The image was a masterpiece of defiance. Her emerald green satin dress glowing like an ancient jewel, her cherry red blazer structured and sharp, and her vibrant ginger afro haloed by the moonlight of a digital Caribbean sky. She wasn't just a model, she was an apex predator. Below the screen, on a raised obsidian stage, the real Christina stood in the same iconic outfit. Beside her, Billy Langner didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a king who had finally found his queen. He didn't stand in front of her. He stood at her shoulder, his presence a silent, lethal warning to anyone who had ever called her an anomaly. Humiliated rivals from the 14th floor were there, buried in the crowd, their faces pale as they looked up at the woman they had mocked. They were invisible now, mere shadows in the wake of her light. Billy stepped to the microphone, his gravelly voice amplified across the district. "They told us Seoul wasn't ready for fire," he said, his eyes meeting Christina's amber gaze. "They were wrong. Seoul belongs to the fire." As the city lights of Gangnam pulsed in rhythm with the billboard, Christina looked out at the sea of awestruck faces. She had moved to this city as a dare, and tonight she had one. She wasn't just the face of Sun Noir, she was the new pulse of the city. "I told you, Billy," she whispered as the flashes blinded them both. I don't just lead the room, I lead the world.